Good morning. How's everybody feeling this morning? Good morning for those of you who are at home. We're excited that you could join us. We're in the book of Ruth. We've been covering a lot of ground this year, and it's been exciting. How many of you guys like romantic comedies or date movies? Go ahead and just raise your hand. Jerome, I see that hand. Go ahead and put it up there nice and high. Yes, we know. What's your favorite romantic comedy? Is it Sleepless in Seattle? Princess Bride. Just jump right in. My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Woo, there you go. Divine Sisterhood of the Yaya, or Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood. Rocky 1 through 5. I mean, what can be more romantic that every time he gets in trouble, he needs Adrian to get his strength and to get his power back? Yo, Adrian. What's more romantic than that? Well, I used to think of the book of Ruth as the romantic comedy of the Bible, the date night book. There's a lot of talking in this book. 55 out of 85 verses are all conversation. There's not a lot of action. So it's one that a lot of people like to skip past. I used to think of this as the Hallmark Channel. I would rather watch, the Oprah Channel than read the book of Ruth, which says a lot. It's only 4 chapters long for the book of Ruth, and it can actually be outlined by the word Ruth. So if you're a note taker, it's going to be R-U-T-H. Everyone say it with me. R-U-T-H. There you go, Ruth. All right. So the R stands for ruin, just like my technology. It's ruined. It starts out with a family that's devastated. They lose their home. They lose their husband. They lose their father-in-law. They lose a lot of stuff. It's like a Coen's Brothers movie. There's a lot of ruin that goes on. The U stands for U-turn. After living in Moab for 10 years, all of a sudden they decide to move back to Israel, and there's a complete 180 that takes place in the story. There's a U-turn. The T is for true love. Everyone say true love. So romantical. Ruth falls in love with a man named Boaz. Boaz is a stud of a man's name. You can't help but love a Boaz. This section takes up most of the book. And then the H is hope. Everyone say hope. Ruth's marriage to Boaz ends up leading to the birth of Obed that then leads to David and then eventually to Jesus. But before we get to happily ever after, there are some other things that we have to get to first. Now, one thing I want to point out before we really dive in is if you read through the book of Ruth and you come to the end, you'll see that there are 2 genealogies. One is a short one that lets you know, okay, this is going to lead to David, so this is why the story is important. But then there's another genealogy right afterwards, which is 10 names long. Now, for most of us, we think, big deal. But if you're a biblical scholar or you've spent a lot of time in the Old Testament, you realize that whenever there's 10 names in a row, it's significant. So the last time we saw this was with Noah and then Abraham. And so each time God does something different with redemptive history, there's a 10-name list that happens just before it. And so the author is cluing you in that God's about to do something significant with David, but you have to come back next week to hear what that is. But for now, we know that the story is connected to that. So there's a bit of foreshadowing that is taking place. I want to look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. If you have your Bible, go ahead and turn there. Otherwise, it will be up on the screen. In the days when the judges ruled. The word ruled should be taken lightly. As we went through the book of Judges last week, we realized it was 200 years of apathy and anarchy. There was a lot of not ruling taking place. I was at Starbucks not that long ago, and there was some parents in there with their kids, and all of a sudden they decided to go outside and have a smoke break and leave the 7-year-olds by themselves, which we loved. And the 7-year-olds acted like 2-year-olds. They only had one volume, which was full blast. They were taking these cars and they were like launching them off the tables, almost hitting people. They were running around shooting everybody. And they were just acting crazy. They were more caffeinated than the people who were inside drinking caffeine. And all of a sudden, the moms came back in, and I thought to myself, now they're going to get it. I was so excited. It's like, they're going to get it now. But instead, the moms were just as awful as the kids. It just got worse because now there were the kids plus the moms. And their rule was a lot like the rule of the judges. Even though God raised up 12 judges, 12 leaders, there was still a lot of anarchy and apathy in Israel. Samson, anyone? During the time of the judges, it was hard to find a model citizen. There were few moral models. No church like the well. We are not told which judge that Ruth comes under, but we just know it was during that 200-year period. And so we need to keep that in mind. You're supposed to read both books kind of side by side. All right? In the Hebrew Bible, Ruth actually comes after Proverbs chapter 31. So the books are actually outlined differently. Ruth comes right after Proverbs chapter 31, which is all about the noble woman. In fact, when Ruth meets Boaz, Boaz refers to her as a noble woman. That is not coincidental. In the midst of all this unfaithfulness in the book of Judges, God has a woman from Moab who is faithful. At a time where the end of the book of Judges says everyone did what was right in their own eyes, there was a woman who did what was right in God's eyes. They're meant to be read side by side. Ruth was a woman who honored God. This is one of the reasons why Ruth was the second most popular name in the Bible. Until Mary came along, it was Ruth. She was the most popular. And then Mary upstaged her for some reason. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because the book doesn't actually start with Ruth. It starts with a woman by the name of Naomi. Everyone say Naomi. All right, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a little while in the country of Moab. Bethlehem means house of bread. You know times are rough when the house of bread runs out of bread. There's no pumpernickel, no sourdough, no wheat, no white, no Wonder Bread. It would be like Hershey, Pennsylvania running out of chocolate. Antarctica running out of ice. And Seattle running out of coffee and depressing music. The housing market crashes. The unemployment rate soars. Poverty led to an increase in crimes. And people were living on ramen noodles. It was tough. It felt like the year 2020, but without hand sanitizer and masks. It was a difficult situation. But God had promised the Israelites long ago that if they lived within the land of Canaan and they obeyed him, that he would take care of them, that he would provide for them. In fact, Elimelech's great-grandson David will write in Psalm chapter 33, verse 18 through 19, he will say, "But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine." Listen to that last verse. To keep them alive in famine. God is not limited by a person's checking account. God is not limited by the Dow Jones. God is not limited by what's going on with Bitcoin. God can keep them alive in famine. Not to make them exempt from famine, but to keep them alive in famine, which is drastically different. But it looks like Elimelech doesn't trust God to come to the rescue and to provide during this time, to bring daily bread. So he takes matters into his own hands. Rather than dealing with the root problem of why there is a famine, he decides to run. Moab was about 20 to 30 miles away from Bethlehem. I'm going to show you a picture up on the screen. Shows you where Moab is, just right over there on the other side of the pond. Now, it's only 20 to 30 miles if Naomi's driving. If Elimelech's driving, it's like 300 miles. It's going to be a lot of circles all around the place trying to get there. It was just on the other side of the Dead Sea. It could be reached in just a couple of days by foot, but morally, it couldn't be any further away. Moab were the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. And there was a lot of tension between the Moabites and the Israelites. The people of Moab had oppressed the Israelites for 18 years. For 18 years, they had oppressed the Israelites. They served the god Chemosh. There was child sacrifice, temple prostitution. They didn't celebrate important holidays like Pastor Dan's birthday. It was chaos. Ruth chapter 1, verse 2. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, I know some of you are thinking of potential names for kids and grandkids. Let me say that Mahlon and Chilion would be a bad choice. Not just because they're hard to spell, but because of what they mean. It'd be like naming your kids swine flu, COVID, or Ebola. Your kid's not going to thank you for that. But there's a message behind the names, which is often the case in biblical stories. Elimelech means the Lord is my king. He's not living like it. Well, that's what his name means. The Lord is my king. Naomi means pleasant. Oh, that's sweet. Mahlon means sickly. Thank you, Mom and Dad. The kids don't even have to make fun of me by rhyming my name. My name just means sickly. But worse is his brother Chilion means death. Maybe that's where we got kill from. I don't know. Death. When God stops being our king, sin is pleasant for a while, but then it eventually leads to death. Eventually it leads to death. The death of future, the death of friends, the death of family, the death of faith. Originally, Elimelech intended to stay for just a short while, but then the visit turns into 10 years. There's a Chinese proverb that says that the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. We don't always realize how far our sin is going to take us. Here's the deal. You can choose your sin. You cannot choose your consequences for your sin. You can choose your sin. You cannot choose the consequences for your sin. For Elimelech and his sons, it leads to death. We don't know if he died of old age, massive heart attack, got ran over by a camel. We're not told. We just know that he dies. And all we know is that things are spiraling out of control quickly for him and his family. First, they lose their home, their job, their retirement plan, and now they lose their husband, their father, and the death of both sons. It's like someone took the ingredients to their life, put it in a blender, kept the lid off, and didn't turn the off button off. It's just spraying everywhere. To understand the desperate situation Naomi is in, we need to keep in mind what her options were when her husband dies and her sons die. Typically, when a woman became a widow, these were her options. Get remarried, move in with mom and dad, or be taken care of by your sons. Those were not options for her. Her situation seemed helpless and hopeless. There was no Medicare, no retirement home, no Walmart hiring senior citizens, no options. I saw a meme that summed up Naomi's life very well this last week. It says, I found out that squirrels can have up to 15 babies in a single litter, and now I totally understand why they're always running out in front of cars. Makes sense. I'm sure she would have loved for a car to just run her over at this point. It's like everything has fallen apart. What's left? Just run me over now, God. Just get it over with. Ruth chapter 1, verse 6 through 7. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Elimelech went seeking what the Lord was going to provide in his own time. God brought provision, but he removed himself by going to Moab. The Lord comes to the aid. And some of you, like Elimelech, are experiencing some rough stuff these days. And your temptation is to run. Not physically, because you don't run physically, but metaphorically. You want to run. You want to run from your relationships, run from your job, run from your litter of 15 squirrels. You want to run. Dealing with the physical problem of no food, but not the spiritual problem of why there is no food. God, why is this famine here to begin with? What is it that we need to deal with our hearts and our lives? You see, the problem is always out there. It's always someone else. I'm the victim. They're the villain. You fail to see your side of the equation. I was standing in the bathroom this last week. It was early in the morning, so I was in the process of getting ready, and I had my shirt off, and I'm looking in front of the mirror, and I'm brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden my youngest comes in and slaps me on the gut and says, good morning, Billy. And I don't know what was worse, the fact that he slapped my gut or the fact that it took a minute for it to stop jiggling. I don't know what was worse. And I could be mad at him, or I could be mad at myself for the fact that I have punctuated every meal with dessert. I have earned that gut. So I decided to take a moment, grab a Snickers, and think and pray about it. Lord, what are you trying to teach me in this situation? Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. God is mentioned 22 times throughout the book of Ruth. This is the first time that God is mentioned. The author wants us to realize that God provides, but it's always in his time. It's always when he has set up his clock, his calendar, not always our clock, our calendar. Elimelech removes himself from the parameters of God's blessing and misses out because of it. See, throughout history, God has used both his right hand and his left hand. His right hand of overt miracles and his left hand of providence, or coincidences that are too coincidental to be coincidence. Providence. God provides. I could write an entire book on those coincidental moments, those providential moments. In fact, this last week, a friend of mine was praying about a job situation. He said, God, if you want me to take this job, then I need you to give this certain amount. And it was a ridiculous amount. It's like one of those amounts, like they're not going to offer that, but I'm just going to put it out there. That way I know that this is what God wants me to do. He went in for the interview, and they offered that exact amount without prompting, not a penny more, not a penny less, and he's an atheist now. Those moments happen all the time if you look for them. God provides. Within the book of Ruth, there are no overt miracles. There's no burning bushes, no talking donkeys, no people who are raised from the dead. But God is constantly behind the scenes moving the story along, and that's why Ruth is so popular. I relate to the book of Ruth because it often feels like my life. There are moments of tragedy, moments of triumph, and a whole lot of moments of tediousness. Daddy, look at this magic trick. Daddy, look at this magic trick. Daddy, look at this magic trick. It's the same magic trick over and over and over again, and it wasn't spectacular the first time. But God uses all of it. Because of this, Ruth was read once a year within the Jewish culture on the day of Pentecost. So every year on the day of Pentecost, they would read the book of Ruth. Now think about that. Ruth is the only non-Israelite that gets a book in the Bible. She was a Moabite. Now she marries into the Jewish religion, but she's the only non-Israelite, and she gets read every year. That's significant. Out of all the 39, that one. The book was a reminder that no matter how silent God might appear, he's always at work. And that's why it was read every year. Because guess what? Burning bushes don't happen a lot. It only happens once. Talking donkeys don't happen a lot. It only happened once. But what happens a whole lot is providence. God working behind the scenes. Maybe he hasn't performed an overt miracle for you lately. Maybe you've never seen a burning bush. Maybe you've never seen a healing. But God is still actively at work behind the scenes. Aiden loves the book of Ruth. This is why he's crying right now. He's like, Pastor Dan, that's my favorite book of the Bible. Everyone else said New Testament earlier, but Ruth is my jam. If God is only at work when there's burning bushes and people raised from the dead, then God takes a lot of vacations. Ruth is this reminder that even when it seems like God is silent, he's at work. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16 through 17. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back." Naomi had said, "You guys go ahead and stay here, stop following me. I'm not going to provide any more kids for you to marry, so go back." She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me." This has been quoted in gazillions of weddings. It is such a significant and pivotal moment in the story. I don't think we realize what a big sacrifice this is for Ruth. Because we know the end of the story. We know the happily ever after. She does not know that in this moment. What she knows is there's going to be a lot of sacrifice. She's leaving family. She's leaving friends to follow a very unhappy lady. 7 times the author is going to remind us that Ruth was a Moabite. Just about every time you see Ruth, it's Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. It's repeated 7 times for a reason. Ruth wouldn't have gone around proudly saying, "Hey, everybody, I'm a Moabite." We don't talk about Moab. Jewish people didn't like the Moabites. The Moabites oppressed them for 18 years. The Moabites worshipped a plurality of gods. They were seen as the enemies. I was at McDonald's. I was going through the drive-thru, and I was ordering a regular iced coffee. And I got ready to pay, and I pulled out my wallet, and I accidentally handed him a Starbucks gift card. I kid you not, the guy looks at me and goes, "You could get physically hurt for this." Clearly, there's animosity between him and Starbucks, and I felt bad. So I went to Starbucks, I got him a coffee, and I brought it back to him. But in spite of the injustice that she knows that she's most likely to face, she decides to follow Naomi anyways, to show faithfulness, to show loyalty, to show hesed. She was faithful even when her father-in-law died. She was faithful even when it looked like she would never get pregnant. She was faithful even when she lost her home. She was faithful even when she lost her husband. She had every reason to give up, and yet she chooses faithfulness even when she doesn't see fruitfulness. She chooses faithfulness even when she doesn't see fruitfulness. It looks like her obedience is not paying off. Ruth chapter 1, verse 19 through 21. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Yay! When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the woman exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Listen to Naomi. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." All throughout the book of Ruth, God is going to be referred to as the personal name of God, Yahweh. But in this particular moment, God is referred to as Shaddai, or the Almighty God. And it is strategic. Naomi refers to God as Almighty, or as Shaddai. In other words, if God is so powerful, why did he let this happen to me? If God is the Shaddai, the Almighty God, why is my husband dead? Why are both of my kids dead? Why did we lose out on our home and our friends and our family? Why has all this happened to me? She asked a very raw, unedited question. Why didn't God protect us? Why isn't God living up to his potential? But notice what Naomi says. She claims that God brought her back empty. I went away full, I've come back empty. But who's standing next to her? Ruth. There's a reason why the book is called Ruth and not Naomi. Because of what God's going to do through Ruth for Naomi. But she doesn't see it right now. All she sees is the loss, the bitterness. But she doesn't see what Ruth brings to the table. Right now, Naomi's too bitter, too cynical to see what Ruth brings. When I read this, I couldn't help but think of Jack and the Beanstalk. Because that's what you think of when you're reading the Bible. You think of kids' stories. Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack's family is suffering financially, so his mom sends him out to take a cow and to trade it for some money. And what does Jack do? He sells it for some magic beans. It just makes sense. He comes back and he's very excited. He says, Mom, I didn't bring you back money. I brought you back magic beans. And how does the mom respond? You dum-dum. What is wrong with you? You are clearly taken after your father's side of the family. That's what she says. She takes the seeds and she throws them out the window because they're just garbage at this point. But what happens? That night, the seeds sprout into this huge, giant plant, this beanstalk. He climbs it and finds a magical world where all of a sudden he sees that there's this giant fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. If he be alive or dead, I'll crush his bones and turn it to bread. They just don't make kid stories like that anymore. I mean, I've never been like, I want me some bone bread. That just sounds delicious. I'm tired of this Wonder Bread. Bone bread, I bet that's gluten-free. That's going to be good for me. Jack discovers a bag of gold and a goose that lays golden eggs. I feel bad for that goose. Lays golden eggs, and now he's rich. He's acquired more wealth than he could ever have gotten from the cow. But nobody knew what Jack had in those magic beans. They just saw him as a dum-dum. And there are times where God has something in our life, and we see it as trash, and we do not realize the potential that is laying dormant or latent within that person. Some of you don't realize what you have in your spouse. Some of you don't realize what you have in your job. Some of you don't realize what you have in your pastor. I'm just kidding. That's purely sarcastic. And you're tempted to just throw it away, to be done with it, to run. Naomi doesn't realize what she has in Ruth. But at the end of the book, Naomi's going to refer to Ruth and say, you're better than 7 sons. She gives her the ultimate compliment. You're better than 7 sons. This was a male-dominated culture. Like having a daughter was awesome, but having a son was awesome sauce. Like it was just a little bit better. Daughter's great, son's better, but the number 7 was the number of completions. If you had 7 sons, you were a baller. Like that was the best you could do. 7 sons was the ideal situation. Your retirement was secure. 7 sons were the things that TV reality was made of. A Jew and her crew. But Ruth was better than any of that. She says, you're better than having 7 sons because of what you've done, Ruth. Turn to the person next to you and tell them, you don't know what I'm capable of. But don't say it in a sinister way. Don't say it in a like, you have no idea. Just like a light, kind way, like happy. I'm hearing a lot of evil. Instantly regret. All right. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. Let's see here. Where'd you go, chapter 2? There you are. All right. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Everyone say Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. Notice she doesn't offer to go with her. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, as it just so happens, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. The phrase, as it turned out, is the Bible's way of saying what looked like a coincidence is providence. As it so happened, but God's hand is behind it. There are three main characters in the book of Ruth. You have Ruth the Moabite, you have Naomi the widow, and you have Boaz the farmer. Some of you would love to have a husband like Boaz. Smart, like Albert Einstein. Spiritual, like Billy Graham. Strong, like Idris Elba. Successful, like Elon Musk. Sings, like Bruno Mars. When you mix these together, you have Pastor Jason Ingram. I have a picture for you. Yeah. Now here's the problem. He's already married, and Danielle will fight you. So you're going to have to lower your standards. You don't get a Boaz. You get something besides a Boaz. You get a Dan Stanford. Boaz was the Pastor Jason of his day. He's the kinsman redeemer, which meant that he was the only one who could save the day. He could keep their house from going into foreclosure. He could save the property. He had the ability to keep their land from going into foreclosure. He would ensure their protection and their provision. You see, the book of Ruth is about the hidden providence of God. How there's miracle behind the mundane and the mess. How God will use a Moabite named Ruth and the son of a prostitute named Boaz. It's interesting. We learn in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, that Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse. Boaz's mother was that prostitute Rahab that we read about in Joshua. It's interesting. And yet he grows up to be a very wealthy businessman in Israel. So wealthy that after 10 years of famine, he still got a lot of money. Cha-ching. He's doing very well for himself. Where you come from doesn't determine where you end up. Maybe you have a family history that you're ashamed of, but that does not have to define you or where you go. At that time, God commanded his people to practice what was called sloppy farming. They were to leave the edges of the grain field. And then anytime they were going through and they were harvesting, anything that fell to the ground was supposed to be left behind, almost like the fries in the back of your vehicle, so that the poor could come along and they could be provided for. Ruth going out to Boaz's field was like going to a soup kitchen or going around and picking up metal scraps and trying to turn that into some money. She's hoping to scrounge up enough for a meal, but that's not the place where you go to find a husband. That's not where you go to find your happily ever after. Boaz will go on to give Ruth 30 to 50 pounds of grain that day. She went looking for a handout, looking for a meal, and she walks away with enough food for an entire week. Boaz hooks her up. Listen to what Boaz prays for Ruth. This is beautiful in Ruth chapter 2, verse 12. Ruth chapter 2, verse 12. It says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done," talking about taking care of Naomi. "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel," and here's the key phrase, "under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It's a beautiful prayer. That's something that would be great for you to pray over other people. But listen to the way she responds to him in chapter 3, verse 9. Chapter 3, verse 9, she says, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my kinsman redeemer." She uses the same phrase that he used talking about God's wings covering her. She says, "You need to be an answer to your own prayer, bud." Stop delegating to God what God's delegated to you. You could be the answer that you've been praying. You see, sometimes we delegate to God what he's delegated to us, and God's saying, you need less prayer and more obedience. Do something with what I've given you. Boaz will go on to do just that. Now, as I've reflected on this 3,000-year-old text, I've been surprised. I find it challenging. I find it rewarding. You see, the story of Ruth starts in tragedy. Ruth loses her husband, loses her brother-in-law, her father-in-law in a very short period of time. But by the end of the story, her situation has done a 180. She goes from Moab to Israel. In Moab, there was a plurality of gods. She tells Naomi, your God will be my God, and so goes into a situation where Yahweh is God. She goes from being a widow to a wife, from poverty to riches, from being childless to eventually having a child named Obed, who then has Jesse, who then has David, and then further down the family tree has Jesus. But what's interesting to me as I've reflected on this is the situation from when they get back to Jerusalem to the end of the story is about 3 months. In a 3-month time, God totally changes her story and her situation. You see, there are times when we're depressed, there's times when we're anxious, there's times where we feel like life is hopeless and we don't know what the future holds, but you don't know what God can do in 3 months' time. What your story is today doesn't have to be the end of your story if you're willing, like Ruth, to be faithful even when it seems like things aren't fruitful. We don't know what God can do with our situation. Look at how Ruth ends in chapter 4, verse 16 through 17. We're going to take communion here pretty soon. Ruth chapter 4, verse 16 through 17. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What can God do with our stories? How can He turn them around and use our pain, our loss, our disappointment?